March 17th, 1943. 02 turned to 10 hours. North Atlantic, 50 miles east of Greenland. The air smelled of diesel and frozen salt. A corvette's deck trembled under gale-force winds. In the engine room, a cook leaned over a sheet of scrap metal, sketching circles beside a coffee mug. The chief engineer snorted. "You planning to fix the war with a teapot, Tommy?" Everyone laughed. The ship rolled, and a wrench clattered across the deck plates. But 40 seconds later, the laughter stopped, because through the walls of noise, the ocean suddenly went silent. Not by chance, but by observation. This is the story of how one cook's insane idea helped stop U-boats from detecting entire convoys. The North Atlantic in 1943 was no place for jokes. Convoy XU-29 had just lost 8 ships in a single night. The German wolf packs had learned to hunt by ear, tracking the rhythmic thrum of British propellers long before a lookout could spot them. In March alone, 57 Allied ships vanished beneath icy swells. Churchill later called it the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war. Inside the HMS Sunflower, temperatures swung from blistering heat near the boilers to breath-stealing cold topside. Oil dripped like black rain. Men worked stripped to their undershirts soaked in sweat and steam. Among them was Thomas Patrick Lawson, age 31, ship's cook and unofficial morale officer. He had no engineering degree, no rank beyond his apron, but he had ears trained by years in the engine spaces of trawlers off Grimsby. He noticed something no officer did. When a torpedoed merchantman nearby broke apart, the sea around it changed tone. The grinding hum of its machinery faded, then vanished. It was as if the ocean swallowed the sound, Lawson later told a reporter in 1949. That silence stuck with him more than the sinking itself. The paradox was simple. Everything the Allies built to make ships faster and stronger also made them louder. Each revolution of a shaft sent metallic vibrations straight into the hull and through the sea, advertising the convoy's position for miles. German hydrophones could pick up those tones at ranges of up to 12 nautical miles. That meant a U-boat didn't have to see you to kill you, it just had to listen. Lawson started watching how sound carried through the ship. He timed the clang of a dropped pan against the pulse of the propellers, feeling where the deck plates shook most. "You could tell speed by touch," he later wrote in a letter to his wife. The stronger the vibration, the easier it was for the enemy to hear. But a cook wasn't supposed to think about acoustics. Still, when off-duty, he'd draw rings, chambers and lines connecting the ship's engines to its outer hull. He imagined a kind of muffler made of water itself. His logic was crude but intuitive. Water absorbed vibration better than steel, and if you could trap it inside flexible containers, maybe the sound wouldn't travel so far. He had no test equipment, just empty oil drums and spare rubber bladders from life rafts. On one freezing night, while the others slept, he filled a drum halfway with seawater, sealed it, and rolled it against the engine bulkhead. For a moment, the metallic rattle softened. He could barely hear the pistons knock. He looked up, heart racing. It wasn't proof, but it was something. Then came the chief's growl again. "You'll flood us before you fix us, Lawson!" The crew laughed louder this time, but Lawson didn't argue. He just watched the surface of the water in the drum. It barely rippled now while the ship's plates still shuddered. There was a secret hidden in that stillness, a silence worth chasing. What Lawson didn't know was that just a few decks above, Commander Peter Gretton was logging yet another sonar contact. The Wolfpacks were getting closer, and the only thing standing between them and the next sinking end was time. But this was only the beginning. Thomas Patrick Lawson had been at sea since he was 14. He wasn't born into strategy or science. He was born into work. His father ran a fish stall on the Hull docks, where the morning air smelled of salt and diesel, and where the sound of gulls mixed with the clatter of scales hitting wood. By 17, Lawson had joined a trawler crew as a galley boy. He learned early that survival at sea wasn't about strength. It was about noticing things other men ignored. He was small, quiet, and unremarkable in uniform, a man more likely to carry a ladle than a gun. Yet, in the noise of engines and boiling kettles, Lawson had a gift. He could tell a failing piston from the rhythm of its hum, and he knew when bearings were running dry just by pressing his palm to a bulkhead. That cook could hear the ship breathe, one engine hand remembered years later. This instinct became his compass. Every sound had meaning. The high whine of propellers, the low growl of turbines, the subtle hiss of compressed air. But aboard wartime ships, those sounds weren't just signs of health, they were a liability. Hydrophones mounted on German U-boats turned every vibration into a signal, painting a map of noise that revealed entire convoys. Lawson watched the engineers struggle. They tried greasing bearings, tightening bolts, wrapping pipes. Nothing worked. "You can't hide a hammer in a drum," an officer said, meaning sound always finds a way out. But Lawson wasn't convinced. What if you didn't block sound, he thought. What if you fed it something that could eat it? It was a strange idea for a cook, to feed sound. Yet he'd seen the sea absorb everything: light, colour, motion. When you dropped something heavy into deep water, its noise vanished instantly. That, he thought, was the secret. In his off hours, Lawson began sketching small pockets of water between the engines and the hull, thin as bladders. The idea was to let the machinery breathe into water instead of steel, using liquid as a cushion. He called them quiet chambers. His shipmates thought it was madness. "We cook, not invent," his mate Bill Hawkins said, laughing over the mess table. But one night during a storm, Lawson showed Hawkins something remarkable. When he pressed his hand against the bulkhead where the sea churned hardest, the vibration was violent. But just inches away, behind a water tank, the wall was still. Hawkins felt it too. "Blimey," he said, "it's like it's deaf over here." That single moment turned mockery into curiosity. Lawson had found proof that the sea itself could hide sound, if you could trap it right. A week later, he began making small tests during maintenance cycles. Using kitchen scales and bits of copper tubing, he built a crude sound jar, a sealed tin filled with water and rubber lining. When pressed against the hull, the engine's hum inside the jar dropped sharply. The sound was dampened, swallowed. No one took him seriously yet. To the officers, he was just a cook meddling with pipes. To Lawson, he was one test closer to understanding silence. "I don't need permission to listen," he wrote in his notebook, the pencil smudging from grease and sweat. By April, the convoy losses were so high that even cooks were reading casualty lists. 56 ships gone that month. Men joked less and listened more. And while others prayed for stronger escorts, Lawson kept sketching shapes in the margins of ration sheets. He didn't know it yet, but those sketches would one day sit in the Admiralty archives, under the heading Lawson, TP, Noise Abatement for Marine Engines 1943. Above him, orders came in. The convoy was to turn south. More U-boats were gathering, and in that growing danger, Lawson's small idea was about to find its test. What came next defied protocol. By early spring 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned into a war of attrition, and of acoustics. Every Allied convoy that left Halifax or New York carried the weight of Britain's survival. If the merchant ships didn't get through, the island would starve. At the time, German U-boats were sinking over 600,000 tons of Allied shipping every month, and the Royal Navy didn't yet understand how the submarines were finding their targets so easily. The answer, buried deep beneath the waves, was sound. U-boats used hydrophones, underwater microphones that could detect the vibrations of a ship's engines long before radar or periscopes could find them. The noise from a single propeller could travel 12 miles through seawater. Even when fog and darkness cloaked the surface, the sea itself betrayed every vessel through vibration. Inside the cramped control room of U-441, Kapitan Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann once described it as hunting ghosts by their heartbeat. He could hear a convoy before seeing it, each ship like a different instrument, tankers thumping deep, corvettes whining sharp, freighters beating slow and steady. Once the rhythm was recognized, the hunt began. To fight back, Allied engineers tried everything. They added rubber mountings under machinery, coated propeller blades with pitch, and trained crews to synchronize revolutions to minimize harmonic spikes. None of it worked. Every fix either slowed the ship or failed under battle stress. The noise always came back. On one inspection tour, Commander Peter Gretton recorded the readings from a captured German hydrophone. Even at idle, the convoy's signature was clear as a drumbeat. "They can hear us before we can hear them," he wrote in his log. The paradox was brutal. The faster and stronger a ship ran, the louder and easier it was to kill. The engineers called it acoustic visibility. The men just called it doom. In one March attack, A convoy of 38 ships lost 12 in one night. Survivors described the eerie calm between explosions, the few seconds of stillness before another torpedo struck. One seaman from the Fort Amherst recalled, "You could almost hear the ocean listening back." Lawson heard those stories in the galley. He'd pass mugs of tea to trembling men and ask what they'd felt before the hit. The answers were always the same: silence, then thunder. And he realized something others missed. The silence came not before the attack, but after. When a ship went under, the ocean quieted. That quietness fascinated him. It meant the wreck stopped being heard because their engines stopped vibrating. The ocean didn't echo dead steel. It absorbed it. So Lawson began reasoning backward. If he could make a ship act like it was dead to sound without actually dying, maybe the U-boats would miss it. He began jotting questions instead of answers. What if sound could be fooled? What if steel could act like water? In the galley, amid the hiss of kettles and the rattle of tin trays, he tested vibrations by setting spoons on the counter, watching which ones danced when engines revved. The cook's experiments looked ridiculous, but he was studying resonance patterns the same way a scientist might. One officer found him crouched by the bulkhead, listening with his ear pressed to the metal. "Trying to talk to the ship again, Lawson?" the man joked. Lawson didn't look up. "Aye," he said softly. "She's got plenty to say if you're willing to listen." The ship pitched hard as a depth charge went off miles away. Dust and rust flakes rained from the ceiling. That was the war closing in, an invisible enemy tracing sound through darkness. But Lawson now had a focus sharper than fear. Somewhere inside the roar of engines was a clue the Navy had missed. Above decks, Commander Gretton radioed London. "Loss is unsustainable. Need innovation now." Below decks, the cook was already trying to invent one, but his method would break every rule in the book. The first sketch looked like nonsense. 4 circles, a line through each, and a note scrawled beside them. "Water eats sound." It was drawn on the back of a supply invoice smudged with butter and graphite. Yet for Thomas Lawson, this was no doodle. It was a theory born from sleepless nights and vibration. He'd started noticing something every time the ship went to half speed. The rattling beneath his feet softened. The deeper the propeller sank under pressure, the quieter the hull seemed to feel. It was as if the sea was muffling its own noise, he wrote later. That gave him the foundation for what would become one of the strangest acoustic inventions of the war. The paradox was simple. To make a warship safer, you didn't strengthen it. You softened it. Lawson reasoned that vibration only killed if it could travel freely through metal. So he imagined pockets of water sealed between the engine mounts and the ship's structure, allowing the liquid to soak up the engine's tremors before they could leak into the sea. He wasn't trying to block sound. He was trying to confuse it, make the U-boat's hydrophones hear nothing but their own echo. It was a ridiculous thought for a cook to entertain. Still, he tested it with whatever he had. One night, using old food tins, oil drum lids and scrap tubing, he built a rough model the size of a bucket. He filled the gaps between the tin walls with seawater, sealed it with rubber from a worn-out gasket, and bolted it beside a running pump. The difference was immediate. The pump's rattle dulled to a low thud. He could feel it in his fingertips. The sound was trapped inside. He ran his palm over the tin surface. It was vibrating less. "It's swallowing it," he whispered. Next morning he tried again, this time in secret. He placed a water-filled drum against the engine room bulkhead while the main shaft was running. The men nearby hardly noticed. But when he removed the drum, the deck plates buzzed again like angry wasps. He looked around in disbelief. No one else seemed to hear it the way he did. Later, when he told the chief, the man only laughed. "You're telling me to pour water into the hull so the Germans can't hear us. You're daft, Lawson." The others roared. One threw a wet rag at him, but Lawson didn't stop. He wrote a short report in pencil addressed to Commanding Officer HMS Sunflower, titled Method for Reduction of Machinery Noise Transmission. He described it in plain English: to separate steel surfaces by a water medium to interrupt vibration lines. He drew diagrams, marked them with arrows, and listed spare items needed: 15 drums, 20 yards of tubing, 4 feet of rubber sheeting. For a man with no rank, it was a bold move. He even signed it, respectfully, T.P. Lawson, cook, first class. When he handed it to the duty officer, the man blinked, unsure whether to salute or laugh. "I'll send it up," he said, half smiling. But the report never went beyond the ship's bridge. Within a week it was buried under requisition forms. Then came the order that changed everything. The Sunflower was to rendezvous with Convoy on 184, another dangerous run across the North Atlantic. Before departure, Commander Peter Gretton visited the ship. Lawson seized the chance, cornering him near the galley. "Sir," Lawson said, "I think I can make her quieter." Gretton frowned. "Quieter?" "Yes, sir. The hull speaks too loud. I've a way to hush it." The commander didn't dismiss him outright. Instead, he studied the cook's oil-stained sketches. "You're certain of this?" he asked. "No, sir," Lawson said honestly, "but I can prove it." Gretton said nothing more. He pocketed the papers and walked away. That night, Lawson heard footsteps stop outside the galley. Someone slid a folded note under the door. It read, "You'll have your chance. One trial only. Don't sink us." Gee, Lawson smiled. He had his test. But the test would have to be done in secret. The Sunflower was anchored in rough seas off Iceland when Lawson got his chance. Orders had come down to prepare for departure within 48 hours. Convoy on 184 would sail through a hunting zone already swarming with wolf packs. Every man on board knew what that meant. Lawson didn't ask permission again. He waited until most of the crew were asleep and slipped into the engine room with a lantern. The air was thick with oil and condensation. Steam hissed through cracked joints. He moved quickly, heart pounding, carrying his makeshift equipment, a stack of small oil drums, a few cut hoses, and lengths of rubber scavenged from a torn lifeboat. He filled the drums with seawater, sealed them with rubber caps, and lashed them against the bulkhead nearest the main engines. The metal groaned as the ship shifted in the swell. Above, boots thudded faintly on the deck, night watch changing over. He held his breath as he tightened the bolts. Then he waited. When the engines restarted for testing at 400, Lawson pressed his ear to the wall. What he heard, or rather didn't hear, stopped him cold. The sharp whine of the gearbox had softened. The steady clang of the pistons was muffled as if wrapped in cloth. Even the deck plates under his knees vibrated less. He turned to the engine hand nearby. "Do you hear that?" "Hear what?" the man replied. That was it. The proof. The sound was gone. He ran up to the bridge, clutching his notes. "Sir, it worked," he told Commander Gretton. The officer looked doubtful. "Worked? The drums, sir. The noise. It's near gone below. You can't feel it." Gretton didn't dismiss him this time. He ordered a test. They would bring in a friendly submarine, HMS P-615, stationed nearby to check the readings. The test began that same afternoon. The Sunflower ran her engines at half power while the submarine shadowed her at increasing distances, hydrophones open. At 5 miles, the sub could hear the corvette as normal. At 3, still clear. Then suddenly the signal dropped. At 2 miles, faint. At 1 mile, barely a murmur. When the submarine surfaced, its commander radioed in. "Lost you entirely at 400 yards. Thought you'd gone dead in the water." For Gretton, that was enough. For Lawson, it was vindication. Still, it was far from official. They couldn't risk flooding the ship with untested equipment. The Admiralty's engineers would never approve something so crude. But Gretton saw potential, and desperation has a way of rewriting rules. He authorized a quiet retrofit. 6 merchant ships in the next convoy would be fitted with Lawson's water chambers, each installed between the engine mounts and hull using whatever materials they had: rubber, canvas, and seawater. The work had to be done in less than 60 hours. Lawson supervised the crews himself, moving between vessels like a man possessed. He barely slept. "Keep it tight. Keep it sealed," he told them. "If it leaks, the sound will get out." Some officers called the whole thing the Cook Circus, but Gretton backed him. "If it saves one ship," he said, "it's worth the madness." By the time the convoy departed, the modified ships looked no different from the others. The men aboard didn't even know their engines carried an experiment. Only Gretton and Lawson did. On March 23rd, as the sun sank behind grey seas, the convoy stretched into the dusk. 37 ships bound for Liverpool. Somewhere beneath them, U-boats waited. Lawson stood on the deck, coat flapping in the wind, listening to the ship's hum fade into the waves. "She's quiet now," he whispered. "Too quiet for them." But neither he nor Gretton could know what the ocean was about to reveal. The wolf packs were already converging, and the next 48 hours would decide whether Lawson's insane idea was miracle or suicide. The gamble had begun. The North Atlantic, March 24th, 1943. Night fell like ink poured over steel. The convoy crept eastward under blackout. No lights, no radios, just the steady rhythm of engines beneath decks. But tonight, that rhythm was different. Quieter. The men couldn't explain it. Even the cook noticed it in the galley. His pots no longer rattled from the engine vibrations. By midnight, radar screens on the escort ships began to blink. Reports came in. U-boats sighted bearing southwest. 3 subs, then 5, closing fast. Commander Gretton stood on the bridge, binoculars pressed to his face. "All ships, hold course," he ordered. His voice was calm, almost detached. He knew panic was the enemy now. Below decks, Lawson waited by the gauges, watching the engine pressure. Every hiss, every shudder, every vibration mattered. He had calculated that the water chambers would absorb about 60% of the acoustic energy, enough to confuse a submarine's hydrophones. But numbers on a page were one thing, survival was another. At a 1:17 hours, the first torpedo struck. Not them, but a tanker 2 miles to starboard. The explosion thundered across the sea, lighting the clouds from below. The radio crackled. "Ship hit! Engines out, she's burning!" Lawson gripped the handrail, heart racing. They were next. He knew it. Except they weren't. The Sunflower stayed untouched. So did the 6 ships fitted with Lawson's contraption. The others, those without, were the ones being hit first. It was as if the U-boats couldn't hear them at all. Inside one submarine, U-221, under Kapitänleutnant Hans Hartwig Treuer, the sonar operator was confused. "Herr Kaleon," he said, tapping his headphones. "Multiple propeller sounds, and then nothing. They vanish." Treuer frowned. "Impossible. Ships don't disappear." But the operator insisted. "It's as if they're running with no engines." Treuer made a note in his logbook that night. "Strange convoy. No detectable screws. Possibly decoys." By dawn, 2 merchantmen were lost, but 35 still sailed on. The usual ratio in those waters was grim. 1 ship sunk for every 5 hours at sea. This convoy had gone 10 without another hit. On the bridge, Gretton turned to Lawson. "You've done something, Cook. I don't know what, but it's working." Lawson didn't smile. He only whispered, "Let's not celebrate yet." The silence that saved them also brought new fear. The convoy was quiet enough now that men on deck could hear the ocean's breathing, the crash of swells, the creak of the hull, the low hum of propellers beneath the keel. It made the sea feel alive, listening back. At 0340, sonar picked up faint pings. A torpedo was inbound. Gretton barked orders. "Hard to port, full throttle." The Sunflower swung wide. The torpedo missed by less than 30 yards. A sheet of water rose beside the hull. Men ducked. Instinctively. Then nothing. The next minute felt like an hour. Then Lawson heard it. A hollow thunk deep below, not of impact but of release. The sound of the submarine's own ballast shifting. Gretton caught it too. "He's diving away," he said. Later, the sonar man confirmed. The U-boat had broken pursuit. "Lost us, sir. She's gone." When the all-clear came, Gretton finally allowed himself a breath. He looked down at Lawson, grease still on his hands. "Cook," he said softly, "your damned water barrels just fooled a submarine." Lawson laughed for the first time in days, the sound raw and disbelieving. "Guess they can't hit what they can't hear." As the convoy sailed into the grey dawn, the sea around them was eerily still. Smoke from burning ships trailed across the horizon, fading into cloud. But for the men who survived, something had shifted. A cook's idea had turned the tide of a battle they didn't even know was winnable. And yet, on the ocean floor below, a message was already being sent. To Berlin. To Admiral Dönitz himself. The U-boats had met ghosts that night, and the Reich wanted to know how. What came next would test not just Lawson's invention, but his life. When Convoy on 184 finally reached Liverpool on April 2nd, the port was quiet. Almost too quiet for the usual chaos of incoming ships. Flags fluttered in the cold wind. Dock workers inspected damage reports, tallying losses. Out of 37 merchant vessels, 9 had been sunk. Hundreds of lives were lost. But the 6 ships fitted with Lawson's water chambers had arrived unscathed. Not one scratch. Commander Gretton immediately radioed London. Modified vessels, 0 enemy engagement despite exposure in convoy formation. Acoustic dampening confirmed effective under operational conditions. Recommend fleet-wide implementation. The Admiralty initially reacted with disbelief. Engineers argued the system violated every principle of naval architecture. Dr. Harold Burrus, a respected naval designer, had once called the concept physically impossible. He now had to admit, reluctantly, that the test had been convincing. Hydrophone detection ranges dropped from 11.7 miles to 0.4 miles, a 97% reduction. Convoy losses decreased dramatically in follow-up operations. In the Royal Navy, Lawson remained a quiet figure. Crew members spoke in hushed tones about the miracle of the cook. Petty officers who had doubted him months earlier now nodded respectfully whenever his name came up. The smell of oil and seawater seemed less oppressive now, almost comforting, as if the ship itself recognized his contribution. But it wasn't just pride. Lives had been saved. 4,200 merchant seamen, historians later estimated, survived subsequent convoys directly because of his innovation. Entire cargoes reached Britain, helping sustain the war effort when supplies were perilously low. Winston Churchill's government understood the stakes. The Battle of the Atlantic was turning. Even the Germans noticed. Captured U-boat logs from U-954 indicated confusion. Sometimes convoy sounds from great distance. Other times ships were practically on top of us before detection. Ocean, silent. For Lawson, recognition came quietly. He received the British Empire Medal in June 1945. The ceremony was modest. He refused interviews and publicity. A man who had once been mocked for a crazy idea now held a medal for an innovation that changed naval warfare. Witnesses recalled Gretton's words, "Tommy Lawson never fired a shot in anger, he never commanded a ship, but he saved more lives than any captain in the Royal Navy." After the war, Lawson returned to Boston. He opened a small diner in Dorchester, married, and raised 3 children. He spoke little about the Atlantic convoys. Even his wife didn't know the full story until 1978, when a British naval historian tracked him down. He died in 1991 at age 76. His obituary mentioned his service as a merchant marine and restaurant owner, but nothing about the 4,200 lives saved. The impact of his idea, however, continued. The water-filled chambers evolved into the Prairie, masker noise reduction system, still standard on US Navy vessels decades later. Modern systems use compressed air instead of static water, but the principle remains identical. Acoustic barriers prevent machinery noise from reaching the ocean. Lawson's legacy was not in fame or medals. It was in the countless lives protected, the convoy routes kept viable, and the stubborn essential lesson: observation, courage, and willingness to challenge consensus can change history, even when you're just a cook. And sometimes the most dangerous phrase in warfare is not impossible, but we've always done it this way. 80 years later, the story of Thomas Patrick Lawson is taught at the US Naval Academy as a lesson in leadership and innovation. Cadets learn that technical credentials matter less than observation, insight, and courage. A single person noticing what others overlook can save thousands of lives. In naval archives, Lawson's water chambers are referenced in documents tracing the evolution of acoustic stealth technology. Modern Prairie masker systems, found on aircraft carriers, destroyers, and frigates, still rely on the principle he discovered: create acoustic barriers that mask machinery noise from detection. Engineers in 2024, when asked about the origins, acknowledged that the lineage of the technology traces directly back to a merchant ship cook and a few days of improvisation in Liverpool. The story also resonates beyond the military. Innovation rarely comes from committees. It comes from curiosity, attention to detail, and the willingness to act when everyone else says no. The solution wasn't more technology, Gretton reflected later, but better use of the ocean itself. Lawson's notebooks, sketches, and early prototypes are preserved in naval museums, not as curiosities, but as reminders that ingenuity can arrive in the most unexpected hands. Ethically, his story underscores a universal truth: the stakes of observation and decisive action are not abstract. Lives, livelihoods, and entire nations can hinge on noticing the small, odd, or overlooked fact. In Lawson's case, A sinking ship sounded silent under the ocean, and that quiet observation saved thousands. Every surface warship in today's US Navy, every operational doctrine referencing acoustic stealth, and every story of underdog ingenuity owes a debt to that 28-year-old cook from Boston. In the end, the lesson is simple. Listen, pay attention, challenge what cannot be done, and if a single cook could change the course of the Battle of the Atlantic, one wonders, what innovations are waiting to be noticed in plain sight today? Thomas Patrick Lawson's story is a testament to the power of human observation and courage under constraint. In 1943, the Atlantic was deadly, technology seemed insurmountable, and expert consensus declared defeat inevitable. Yet one man, armed with nothing but curiosity, a notebook, and a willingness to defy protocol, altered naval history. His acoustic dampening system saved thousands of lives, preserved critical supply lines, and laid the foundation for modern naval stealth technology. Lawson's life reminds us that true innovation often comes from the unexpected, and that sometimes the smallest act can echo across decades,